Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. A message from our sponsor, Arvon. Do you have a story in you? Or want to test the waters of writing poetry or non-fiction? Maybe you already write, and write well, but would like to try a new form or genre, pick up some new tricks.
Enter Arvon. Arvon run a yearly programme of in-person and online events, from 5-day residential writing weeks that take place at one of their 3 writing houses, to pay-what-you-can online events and online masterclasses that delve deep into craft over the course of 2 hours. Their courses cover everything from commercial, genre, and experimental fiction to poetry, screenwriting, and even songwriting.
They've been running creative writing courses up and down the UK since 1968. In that time, their prize-winning tutors, many of whom may be some of your favourite writers, have unlocked the creativity of over 100,000 people. Many have gone on to be published authors and career writers themselves.
But actually, it's not about that. Writing with Arvon is about finding a supportive community of fellow writers, making like-minded connections that last a lifetime. By signing up for a course, you don't just get an acclaimed author as your tutor, you also gain a writing group to bounce ideas off long after the course is finished.
So whether it's a cosy stay at one of their writing houses in Devon, West Yorkshire or sleepy Shropshire, or a course you can do from the comfort of your sofa, Arvon works around your creative life.
Visit arvon.org/courses, that's arvon.org/courses, to learn more and give yourself the gift of writing.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself spoke with the journalist and author Kassia St.
We spoke to Kassia about getting started in journalism, her smash hit debut, The Secret Lives of Colour, and her latest book, The Race to the Future.
Some listeners will also know Kassia as an original co-host of Always Take Notes. It's a great episode, and we hope you enjoy it. Kassia, welcome to Always Take Notes. As we said in the intro, you are a former host on the podcast, so it's great to have you on the other side of this. We wanted to start with the new book, The Race to the Future, and the kind of origin of this idea. And we saw that it came from your research into this colour Rosso Corsa, I believe, with the Italian racing red, when you were looking at it for The Secret Lives of Colour, and you found an anecdote that then you dug into and was not quite as it seems. Could you tell us a bit about where this all began?
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be on here as a guest. So it's a bit embarrassing, really. I wrote The Secret Lives of Colour several years ago now. I was writing it back in 2005, and one of the colours I wanted to research...
2015.
Sorry, 2015. Yeah, I've really aged myself. 2015. And I was researching... One of the colours that I wanted to put in there was Italy's racing red. And I was looking into the origin for it. And the origin seemed very mysterious. I couldn't get a clear answer. But something that, that cropped up a few times was that it had been the colour of the car that an Italian prince had driven across 2 continents in this very early race from Peking to Paris. And I started researching the story, and I just thought, this is the most incredible story, and I had it earmarked to go in the book, but to do my due diligence, I wrote to the museum that now houses the prince's car. And I asked them, I could see in pictures that it was now grey, but there was this whole story about how it had been repainted after it had fallen into the sea after being dropped off a boat. So I wrote to them just to confirm the story, but injudiciously I got carried away, put the story in the book without waiting for the reply. The reply came just after the book went to press, and they said, no, we've tested the paint all the way down to the metal, and there is no red. There is no red at all in any of the paint layers. They are all grey. It's grey all the way down. There was never any red. But by that time, of course, it was too late, and the story had gone into The Secret Lives of Colour. If I'd maybe been a bit more sensible, I'd have just kept stum, and no one would have ever known that I made a mistake and that I was stupid about waiting for the fact check. But I really had fallen in love with the story by this time, and I had started gently researching it and to see if I could find any more sources and find out a bit more about the story. Something that I noticed very early on is that I was not the only person who had created or added to myths around the Peking to Paris legend. There were plenty of them. And so I really wanted to I felt a real drive to get down to the bottom of it and to try and uncover as much of the true story as I could, as would be possible in this day and age, so far removed when, all the original participants are dead.
So where did you start once you'd been gripped by this idea? Did you go straight to the contemporary sources, or did you look at some of the later accounts?
So it was a bit piecemeal, because by the time The Secret Lives of Colour had come out, I was actually already under contract to write my second book, which was not a book about this race. It was a book about textiles called The Golden Thread. So the research was always, at the very beginning, was very, very, very piecemeal. So, one of the first bits of research that I did was I went to Queen's University in Belfast, because they had some documents there, it was very online, all the information I could get about this sort of collection of documents was that it mentioned the Peking to Paris race, but I didn't know exactly what they held in the collection. So I had to go and view it in person. And what it turned out to be was a postcard from the wife of Prince Scipione Borghese to a diplomat and who'd been based in China at the time of the race, who'd actually been to see the start. And it was also a collection of photographs. So there was this postcard, thanking this person for coming to the race, and also a collection of photographs of the very beginning of the journey, when people were kind of milling about in Beijing just before the start of the race. And I looked at these images and I realised I'd never seen any of them before. By that time, I'd read a few of the more recent accounts, and I'd had a fair look online and at various other kind of easily available sources for images, and none of these had been seen before. And I was like, well, if with very little research I can dig up a whole new crop of images, what else is there to discover? And so that kind of gently propelled me all through the time that I was writing, researching and publishing and doing all the other stuff for both The Secret Lives of Colour and The Golden Thread. And it meant that when I'd come to the end of The Golden Thread and it was published, the next project I really wanted to start on was The Race to the Future. Although I wasn't calling it The Race to the Future at that time, it was still kind of vaguely Peking to Paris. But yeah, I knew this was the next project I wanted to sink my teeth into.
And is it right that there were previous book-length accounts of the race published much earlier? Yeah, what's the kind of bibliography of it that you encountered as you got your teeth into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, it was conceived as a publicity stunt. Basically, it was the idea was proposed by a French newspaper. And they kind of threw down this gauntlet to the industry at large, saying, if you think that cars, if you seriously believe that cars are, can fulfill all these promises that you are making to potential customers, then let's show that the car can go anywhere. And so they threw down this gauntlet, and part of the idea of the race was that it would be reported on contemporaneously by journalists who would be embedded with the racers. And the route very closely followed the telegraph wires, so that the journalists could send back daily or sometimes twice daily accounts back to the newspapers back in Western Europe. So you have these newspaper, lots and lots and lots of newspaper materials from various different newspapers. You then have, when the journalists got back, actually this race was really huge at the time, and lots of people knew about it. It was very famous. Lots of people came to see the cars as they went through various cities. So it was very well known. It became kind of a global news phenomenon. There was a lot of international interest in it. So after the end of the race, most of the journalists or the people who'd been writing about the race while they were on it then published their own accounts. So you get about 4 or 5 books and pamphlets written by people who were actually on the race or sort of taking part in it. And then there was another kind of wave of interest in the mid-1950s up until the kind of mid-1960s, and you get a couple of books written in English by English authors in that time period, sort of 50s to 60s, which is quite odd because there were no British people taking part in the race. So why it particularly gripped the British imagination in the 1950s and 60s is a little bit odd, but there was this kind of revival of interest in, very early cars and automobiles, and there's a few films that come out at that time about very early racing. So that, comes as part of that. But these books that are written in the 1950s and 60s, while they're really rip-roaring reads, they did sort of help fuel some of the mythology, and you get some, slight red herrings cropping up, and also, they weren't carefully footnoted. So it could be that, they had access to interviews with, there were a couple of people at that time still alive who they might have asked in person. It could be that they did fantastic interviews, but, it's very hard to track down exactly where they were getting their information from. And as I found out as I was doing the research, some of the information they put in the books and was published was just flat wrong, or at least according to the evidence that I was able to find. So, I felt like there was some unearthing of the truth to be done. And I also felt there was an opportunity to slightly set the record straight and to tell what I believed is a much more interesting story, which is the true one, or as much as I can uncover.
And anyone that follows you on Instagram will know that your research process is organised in a sort of colour-coded, fastidious, frankly amazing way. Can you walk listeners through, listeners who might not have seen that, how you go about sort of structuring your research so that it's usable for you?
Well, thank you for the compliments about my notes. No compliment is likely to get me happier than compliments about my note-taking. But this was a bit of a bigger project for me. My previous books, the individual chapters had been, although there was, overarching arguments in some ways, the individual chapters were more or less standalone. With this book, that was not going to be the case as I initially conceived it. So I knew that I would have a lot more material to manage, and the material would be really sprawling, and so I was quite intimidated by this at the beginning, and actually canvassed a few historians who I admired on their ways of taking notes and organising their notes and going back and referencing the work, because obviously if you're working on something for 5 years, by the time you get to the end you've just completely forgotten what you were researching 5 years beforehand, so you need a way of kind of indexing your work. And what that was all very lovely and people were very helpful, but what I learned was that everyone else's help is completely pointless, because everyone does things their own way, and you have a better sense of how your own brain works than anyone else, and one person's methods may not work for you. So what I do is I write most of my notes by hand, particularly something that I'm taking from books. Mostly because I find that writing by hand, because there's more effort involved, it makes you a bit more judicious about the information that you really need. I'm a bit of a magpie. I like, shiny things, shiny bits of information. And, you can be reading great books and you can be taking down all sorts of notes about, fabulous things, but actually they're not really relevant. And I think that's the temptation if you're photocopying, or if you're, just printing out a load of stuff, or even if you're typing, you can, because it's a bit easier, you're less judicious, and you can just too much is going into the top of the funnel and it just becomes unwieldy. So I tend to handwrite as much as possible. But obviously with this book, I also had a lot of contemporary newspapers. And actually, I quite wanted to have the stories in context. It's useful for me to be able to see where a particular story was placed on a front page. Is it above the fold? Is it below the fold? Where is it next to? Is it, is it next to stories about foreign policy? Is it, opposite the story of a grisly murder? Are they placing it next to adverts for cars? I wanted that context. So I did do a bit more printing with this book than I'm normally comfortable with. And it shows, because I think my notes stretch to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lever arch files in this instance, which is far too much, but it was really helpful for me to have that kind of the context in this case when it came to the newspaper and magazine sources, so it couldn't be helped. Oh, and then once I've got all the material, I then do kind of like mind maps when I'm thinking about organising the chapters. And again, this is mostly done by hand. I have to think about how I'm going to break down the information I want to include, what's relevant to a chapter. And that changed a lot. Initially when I was thinking about the book, I had two structures and I really wasn't sure which one was going to work better. And I ended up, for the first draft, thinking that I would structure the kind of more thematic information, so stuff about how cities operated before the advent of the car and then how they were changed by the car, or the development of the automobile, how it came to be, and the development of the telegraph and how that came to be. I sort of wove that information into the chapters on the race and sort of tried to kind of flow from race information to contextual information within chapters. And I wrote the first draft in that style, and then I knew as I was writing it that it wasn't quite working as well as I wanted it to, but it wasn't until I sent the first draft to my editor and they had a look and they were like, this isn't quite working, that I was like, yeah, I sort of knew that, and what I should have done was what I had sort of was my other idea for the structure, which was basically to have alternating chapters, one chapter on a race, one chapter taking in more contextual information. And so I had to kind of restructure the book in that way, which was a pain in the butt and took ages, but was really worth it. And it works far better in this structure. And I wish that I'd had the courage of my convictions when I was really struggling over the first few chapters. In the first draft, I should have just called a halt and been like, no, this isn't working. I should switch to plan B. But there we go. You live and you learn.
You mentioned in the book that you'd originally had this plan to drive the course yourself in a Land Cruiser, and then COVID intervened and so forth. How did that kind of also affect the change, or the bringing the book together, from moving from this idea that you would cover the ground yourself to then that just becoming impossible?
It was really devastating. I knew that I didn't want to insert myself too much into the book. So in some ways, it didn't much matter. On the surface, it didn't much matter. Because I was never going to be a huge part of the narrative. You've already got 5 different cars with multiple narrators, because some cars had 2 different narrators who were providing information. You've already got these 5 cars, multiple narrators moving through space at different rates, and then you've also got the contextual information. So if I had inserted myself in, and I had also been moving through space at a different time, I couldn't see a way of doing that with any degree of grace or elegance, or even I just couldn't conceive of a way of doing that would be enjoyable for the reader. So I was never going to insert myself too much, but what I really wanted to do was to travel through the landscape and have an idea about how it might have looked from the passenger's own view, but also this landscape has now been really altered, and in large part the car is responsible for that. So I also thought that would be really interesting, and that was something that I really wanted to see for myself firsthand. And my husband and I, we're not particularly adventurous people. We haven't done big overland treks before. I don't know one end of the spanner from another. We're not overland adventurous people necessarily, but I did really want to do this journey, and we all got ourselves psyched up. We bought the car. I started learning Russian. In fact, I'm still learning Russian. And then we got the car in January 2020. COVID happened, and we thought, okay, fine, we'll delay until next summer, because it's really a journey that you kind of want to do in summer, both because the original journey took place in the summer months, but also because travelling becomes vastly more difficult during the winter, and it becomes a very different thing. So we postponed it to the following year. Again, it was a year of COVID. And then by that time I'd handed in the first draft, and I'd also become pregnant. And then we thought, well, okay, sure, I'm going to be giving birth right around the proposed start date, but maybe we'll just fudge that. And as I kind of ballooned in size, I was like, okay. And then war happened. So the best laid plans, God laughs at them, or words to that effect.
I mean, if you had given birth on the route, that would have been a hell of an epilogue. You did do some travel for the book. You went to Italy and Hong Kong, and as you mentioned, Belfast. Was that covered by the advance, or did you sort of do that yourself?
I mostly did it myself. I mean, as you've probably covered, you know, in previous episodes with authors, is the advance is a little bit misleading as a name because you don't get it all in advance. I'm very lucky. This is my third book, and my two previous books have earned out their advances, which means that I'm getting royalty checks, which is lovely. And I also got a grant from the Society of Authors, which massively helped and more or less allowed me to work on this full time, which is not my usual practice. I'm usually working on articles and reviews and so on and so forth at the same time as working on a book project. But, you know, for long stretches of this was all I was doing. So that was a real luxury and an indulgence, which this grant helped me with, and also the fact that I've got two previous books to rely on, that really helps as well. But yes, you don't get all the advance in advance, and you certainly, you know, I mean, maybe in some other genres, but not in history. You're not getting so much of an advance that a quarter of the advance allows you to live the 3 years off it.
We wanted to come back to the new book in due course, but can we roll back now to your sort of early life, and where does your interest in books and writing and stuff like that come from originally, do you think? Did you always have literary aspirations?
Yes, I came out of the womb wielding a pen, which was very uncomfortable for my mother. No, I mean, I was always very interested in stories. I used to have like not a ghetto blaster because that makes it sound too cool, but like a tape machine next to my bed, and even as a very small child, and we used to listen to audiobooks and audio tapes and audio cassettes in the car, and we used to listen to quite grown-up stuff. I really wanted to listen to Millie Molly Mandy as a child, and my father got so enraged with Millie Molly Mandy that he threw the tape out the window, a transgression for which he will never be forgiven. But, you know, because my dad couldn't cope with Millie Molly Mandy, we listened to a lot of Thomas Hardy in the car when I was far too young to understand what was going on. You know, Jane Austen, Sherlock Holmes. We listened to story after story after story after story after story on audiobook, and it's also what I used to help me get to sleep. I'd listen to some cassettes while I was getting to sleep, and in fact I still do to help me get to sleep. I like to have a little audiobook playing as I drift off. So I really loved stories from a very young age. I used to create my own books when I was little, and the subjects I gravitated towards were always the ones where you write, you know, English and history. So that was always kind of part of my makeup, I guess. But I didn't, you know, when I graduated from my undergrad degree, which was in history, I really loved it, and I had considered staying on, doing a master's, doing a PhD at that stage. But I'm, you know, my tendency is to get a bit tunnel vision and to really just sit down in a library and just work and work and work and read and read and read. And I knew that even at that stage, you know, age 20 or whatever I was when I graduated from university, that, you know, maybe my 20s, maybe that would be a shame if I just did that for my 20s, and maybe I should just try something else. And so I moved to London and I started working. Initially, I did a bit of work in PR for a jeans company, which I hated. Sorry, jeans company, you make lovely jeans. But I just spent my days phoning up Vogue and phoning up Marie Claire and phoning up Elle Decoration and trying to chase down pairs of jeans that had been loaned and not returned. And I would make these calls about 5 times a day. And I was like, this is not a job I want to do for the next 5 minutes, let alone for years to come. But I ended up moving to magazines, and I worked first for World of Interiors for a little while, and then I got a job at House and Garden and as assistant food and wine editor, which was great fun. But the day that I got the job, it was the same day that the financial crash really bit. And so, you know, the day I got my job, you were seeing just news clips of people exiting offices, looking a bit stunned, carrying all their worldly possessions. And it was very clear to me that there was quite a lot of fat that could potentially be trimmed from a lot of British magazines at the time. Having a assistant food and wine editor was definitely a bit of a luxury, and I could sort of see the writing on the wall. So I almost immediately applied for a master's. And when eventually they did sort of say, look, we're going to get rid of the assistant food and wine editor position, I already had a place at a university that I could go and do my master's.
Oh, that sounds very canny. What were you doing as assistant food and wine editor?
It was really great. So I wrote food, the tasting notes pages. I've still very proudly got some of the the notes that I made on this is the cheese that you should buy, and these chocolates are delicious, and have you heard of Borough Market? So I wrote stuff like that, which is great fun. I also helped style the food and wine shoots. So I went out and got props and thought about how they should look, and what the theme for that should be. It's autumn, let's have toile de juillet, and it was just really good fun. But I do remember my very first photo shoot. We were shooting a tabbouleh salad, and the photographer kept on. I don't know what was going on. It's so strange, but he kept on seeing little faces that the parsley was making in the tabbouleh salad, and he kept on sending me in with tweezers to rearrange bits of parsley so they'd stop making faces, and this went on for hours. I think we were there for about 5 hours shooting.
He sounds like quite a troubled man.
I don't know what was going on. Anyway, that was my first week, so maybe it wouldn't have worked out long term, but it was a really fun job. I got to eat a lot of food, a lot of wine. I was very popular in the office because mine was the desk that always had food on it, because I used to get a lot of food samples and invitations to restaurants and so on and so forth. So it was a really fun job. It was great.
I definitely like the idea of the existence of assistant food and wine editor as a sort of watermark of peak pre-financial crisis journalistic decadence.
I barely ever matched it. That was the high point of my career.
We are thrilled to announce the publication of Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers. The book, edited by the two of us, features contributions from almost 100 past guests on the podcast. It's a distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 6 years.
The book offers, we think, frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Published by Ithaca Press, Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers is available now in all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
Could you tell us now about your move to The Economist, about how that came about and your sort of rise through the ranks there, and then in due course how you moved on from The Economist as well?
Yeah, it wasn't so... thank you for saying it was a rise through the ranks. I think I more just got in and then fell flat on my face. But I did my master's, and again, I went through this kind of should I stay on and do a PhD? I really enjoy it. I could really see myself just studying history all the time and just being a history professor. But again, I was I'm still in my 20s. Maybe I should get out of the library a bit more and have a life. And not that being in the library isn't having a life, it's what I do now. But, maybe that is not the way to spend my 20s, and maybe I should go back into the workplace. So I applied. What I found, very depressing is that, I'd been out of the job market for a year doing my master's. I guess by the time when all was said and done, it was maybe, a little bit over a year, and getting a job was really difficult. There was just nothing really going. Magazines had been hit incredibly hard by the crash. These fat 2-inch thick magazines were now anemic, half centimetre shadows of their former selves. And so it was really difficult to get jobs in magazines. And I very quickly realised that I wouldn't be able to just get a job like I had at House and Garden, just out of nowhere, just getting assistant food and wine editor. I would have to go for internships. And at that time, internships were unpaid. And it wasn't even easy to get internships because they were quite often, frankly, going to relatives of people who worked in magazines. I'm sure that doesn't happen anymore, but it was definitely the case then. But so I basically harassed people, looking back on it now, and it's still the method that I would say is probably the only way that's going to work unless you have an in. I basically wrote handwritten letters once a week, and alternated those with emails following up And I think in order to get my internship, my unpaid internship at Literary Review, I did a little stint there first, where I worked on, organising the extracts for the Bad Sex Awards, which was something. And then I sent about 5 or 6 letters in order to get my internship at the magazine formerly known as Intelligent Life, now known as 1843, which is part of the Economist family. And I really hassled the editor, got the internship, and then eventually managed to secure a place as, kind of editorial assistant there, which was a step down from my first job, but, in some ways, but was at a magazine that, maybe was a bit more aligned to all my interests. So I was just very grateful to get it. There wasn't an awful lot going.
And how did The Economist change during your stint there? And I should also say to listeners that Kassia and I overlapped while at The Economist. But, social media was something that you sort of helped pioneer, which sounds almost bizarre now, but you were kind of part of the sort of launch project of the social media team.
Yeah, so I, joined Twitter when it was still called Twitter. It's really sad that everything has changed names now. It's making me feel really old. I joined Twitter. I was interested a little bit in social media. I joined Instagram. I had a Facebook account. And so I was used to using social media for myself. And then that became part of my role when I moved sideways into The Economist proper and became assistant books and arts editor at The Economist. And as with a lot of magazines and newspapers at the time, online was seen as it was kind of siloed off. It was seen as very different to the print offering, and was also, as again, I think is very common in kind of legacy news organisations, was often regarded as lesser. And, anything that was online, anything that was social media was slightly looked down on and was kind of really a bit of an afterthought. Again, I'm sure that's not the case now. But, it was a place where you could actually really get given a bit of a chance. And I remember they did this experiment where it was live tweeting the Oscars, I think it was. And so I had all the film reviews that we'd done, and I had film reviews lined up for all the films that were up for that year's Oscars. And I, was just live tweeting, and I really was probably doing a very, not very sophisticated job at all, but it generated huge volumes of traffic for the Economist site. And, the next morning got up and they were like, this is great. Doing something is better than doing nothing. Revolutionary. And so from that moment, you did start to see a little bit more, but, there is this tension between, getting clicks and getting eyeballs is great, but, should that, at what cost does that come? Should that be your guiding light? Should it not be? There is this kind of tension between what is great for social media and what is great for news, and the kind of slippage between the two. But, that was part of my job, and it allowed me to kind of add a bit, carve out a little bit more of extra territory for myself within the assistant books and arts and editor role at The Economist, which I really enjoyed. But by that time, I had been writing a column about colour for Elle Decoration for several years. I'd pitched it as a book, and I was given quite a deadline for writing it. So really, by the time that I kind of was beginning to make a little bit of headway with the social media and beginning to even think about possibly moving up the ranks or carving out a bit more territory for myself and thinking about what my career at The Economist could be, I was working flat out on producing a book, and something had to give.
Just kind of rewinding slightly, we wanted to ask about the kind of origin of The Secret Lives of Colour. Could you tell us about how the Elle Decoration column came about, and then how that moved to becoming the book?
So I was an editorial assistant at Intelligent Life, but I really wanted to write, and I really wanted a kind of regular writing gig. And so I proposed several ideas for columns, and this was the one that I was really excited about and really thought had legs. It was a subject that I'd touched upon when I was doing my dissertations at university. Colour had come up. My dissertations were about 18th century women's dress, in London, and so colour had come up there, and I was like, oh, that's a great idea for a column. It can talk about the history and the kind of identity and the what a colour means. And that was just absolutely, that was absolutely my jam. And I proposed this column to the editor of Intelligent Life, and he just wasn't massively engaged by the idea. I'm pretty sure he never actually read the pitch. But when it became clear that wasn't a goer, I took it elsewhere. I took it to Elle Decoration, and they were interested in it, and they said yes and signed it off pretty quickly. And so I think that was in 2013 that happened. So I was writing the column monthly thereafter, and so each column was about a different shade or dye or pigment, and then I'd write about when it was used, why it was used, and what it meant.
So what was the process of converting that material and that knowledge into like a book proposal, and also how did you get an agent off the back of that?
So I was quite lucky in a way that Elle Decoration had not made me sign any contract for the column. I hadn't signed anything, so there was the rights to this column were pretty murky. But I knew I really wanted to. At one point, basically, they said, we're not too sure if this column, we're thinking of reorganizing this section of the magazine, maybe this column won't make it. And I was like, oh God, I'm not ready to stop writing about colours. And so I thought, okay, well, if I can't write for Elle Decoration, maybe I should write it as a book. In actual fact, they didn't get rid of the colour column. They kept it on for quite a few more years after that. But that fear of losing this thing which I really loved spurred me on to write a book pitch, which I'd never done before. And so I was like Googling like what goes into a book pitch, how to get an agent. And I wrote a kind of very, crappy pitch that I probably still got on my laptop somewhere, and then set about trying to find an agent. And I basically looked at books that I liked and found the authors, and found, you can quite often work out who the a particular writer's agent is, and I would approach them, and got a few no's. And then through a friend of a friend, I heard about Imogen, who is my agent. At that time, she was working at Aiken Alexander. She now works for another agency called Marjac. And I contacted her, sent her this email, and I heard back really quickly, like within a couple of hours, she was interested and wanted to meet up. And I don't know, I have this thing, I'm not too sure if it's actually a memory or if I've just kind of supplied it to myself. I know that we met up, but in my mind we met up at the Wolsey. This seems far too fancy for where I was at that time of my life, and probably where she was at her time, at that time in her life. But in my mind, we met up at the Wolsey, and I, like the typical geek that I am, I brought my pitch. I brought like books that I thought would be similar to, and where I could sit like in a bookshop, and what I imagined it looking like. So I had like my little bag of show and tell with me. And we really got on, and she helped me make a decent pitch and then send it out to editors, and it was great. There was actually a bidding war for it, which was very exciting. And I was working that day at The Economist, and my lovely boss, who you will know, Fiammetta, at the time, was like guiding me through what I should say to various offers, and I was like hyperventilating, sweating mess, and not getting any work done at all. And she kindly bore with me, and then within a couple of days I had this great offer, and was contracted to write a book, and it was fantastic.
The Secret Lives of Colour was a big success. So it was translated into 20 languages.
23 now.
23. Sorry, we're misinformed. It's always really interesting on the show to ask people who've had an experience like that of when it became clear that the thing was gathering momentum, and if they are able to sort of trace the factors that led to it taking off, which is often very difficult to do. But do you have a sense of how it snowballed, and what was what was pushing the snowball?
Yeah, so I think this is probably why I think this has served me really well, because I think a lot of people want that first week or the first month of a book's life when it's published to be an absolute, like, all singing, all dancing, reviewed in every magazine, reviewed in every newspaper, and they want, like, that kind of instant success. And I think that people feel like if they don't get that, then it can't happen. Whereas actually with The Secret Lives, that wasn't quite the case. I think, for a first book, it did pretty well. Like, John Murray clearly believed in it. Like, they'd produced their catalogue for the autumn-winter season, and their catalogue, wore the same kind of livery as my book. So clearly they really believed in it. They put a lot of effort into it, and it did get some good extracts, I think, in the Mail on Sunday, I think, and maybe the Telegraph. So that was really huge. Again, not what you'd expect for a first book. But then actually it didn't get widely reviewed. Some of the early reviews were not very positive. I remember Fiammetta saw the very first review before I did, and she was like very kindly like, so I've seen this review. It's not great, but it's great that it's been reviewed at all. That review was in the FT, by the way, and much to my delight, they've taken out one word from the review, charming, and has been used on the cover ever since. But actually, the review itself is a bit of a stinker, but it shows that no matter what, the book publishers will find a way to spin a turd into gold. But actually, really no one took much notice of the book for about 6 months, and then after 6 months, maybe it was longer, maybe it was 7 or 8 months, after 7 or 8 months it was picked up by the BBC to be a Radio 4 Book of the Week. So it was published, I think, in October or November 2016, and then it was Book of the Week in June 2017, so quite a fair while after publication. And then after that, it started to get momentum. The paperback came out that autumn, or maybe it was even the following autumn, and became a Waterstones paperback book of the month. And it just had this really long tail. It never had that, big flash at the beginning. It was quite a slow burn, a slow and consistent burn, and it's still selling. The 23rd language deal was only agreed this week, so it's still selling. It's still doing pretty well for itself.
What is the 23rd language, Kassia?
Brazilian Portuguese.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So how soon, where in the midst of all of this did the golden thread then emerge?
So I'd slightly stupidly, I'd gotten the book deal for The Secret Lives of Colour in, I think, the June, and they'd sort of said, we're going to want the book by the end of the year in order to publish it for the following Christmas. But they hadn't given me a contract, and I didn't get a contract until, I think, August or September. And what I should have done is just started working on it full speed straight away, because 6 months is not a massively long time to write a book, particularly when I knew that I'd have to rewrite all the material that I'd written for the Elle Decoration column. Like any time there was an overlap, I had to completely rewrite the material, and there were 75 colours in the book, and I hadn't, by that time I'd only written about 12 or 13. Maybe it was a few more than that, but I hadn't written that many columns, so I had to produce a lot more material, and I had to reproduce any material that overlapped. So I should have just started working hell for leather straight away, but I didn't. I couldn't quite believe that it had happened until I got the contract, and so I only really started working on it, at anything like a good clip, end of summer, early September, and it had to be in December. And I slightly panicked. The Economist very kindly agreed to let me have a 6 weeks unpaid book leave, which was quite unusual for my position. The Economist does allow people to have book leave, but generally you give a bit more notice, and also you're slightly higher up the ranks than I was. I was very lowly, so it wasn't typical for people at my level to be given unpaid book leave. So I was very lucky, but luckily we had a great person to come in and cover for me while I was on book leave, and that person is called Rachel, and promptly massively embarrassed me by being far better than I was at my job.
Absolutely not true, but carry
Sorry,
on.
I was really redundant when I came back, but never mind. But yeah, I went away and did my and had some book leave, and I had to really rush to get this thing done in time. But as a result of that, I'd really overworked myself. You know, I didn't finish it all during this 6 weeks. I came back and I was working full time at The Economist. In order to get the book finished, I was waking up at kind of 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning, working for a few hours before going to work, and then going to work a full-time job, and then coming back in the evening and probably working for a couple of more hours in the evening, and then working at weekends as well. And, you know, you can sustain that level of work for a few weeks, but it is unsustainable long term. And basically, I was also quite stressed about my job at The Economist. I really loved working in the books and arts section, but it wasn't quite fulfilling me. I also had this, you know, a lot of my friends at that time, I was approaching 30, a lot of my friends were kind of moving up their corporate ladders in their own way, and I felt like I was stagnating at The Economist. I felt like I'd been there for quite a while. I wanted to write more, and I wasn't getting that opportunity. I'd applied for a few jobs within The Economist and been turned down for them all. And I just felt like, you know, I just, you know, overworked myself, was a bit down about my job and my position and what was happening with my career. And I, you know, basically looking back on it, I had a bit of a breakdown. I think I probably cried at work a few times, and I was just like, I can't do this. And my publishers were really keen for me to write another book. I had another great idea, you know, for a book about textiles, and it just became very clear to me that I couldn't go through that experience again. I couldn't write another book while working full time, and it was clear to me that The Economist, there wasn't a path for me forward at The Economist. It just wasn't going to happen. And so something had to give. And so I decided I'd go freelance and work on books full time. But that was terrifying because I think I handed in the manuscript for The Secret Lives of Colour on the Monday. And on the Friday before, that had been my final day at work. And then I got up on the Tuesday and was like, great, now what? What have I done? I don't have a job. I've got a book to write, but, you know, my first book isn't even published and we've got no idea if it's going to be a success. I just felt like I just had a bit of a weird, weird few months. And that was a pretty frightening time.
You sort of touched on it earlier, but how did it work sort of financially once you'd made the decision to go freelance? What was the balance between the book writing with all of the, advance issues and then, freelance work, which is obviously a bit more piecemeal?
Well, I'm incredibly lucky in that my mother passed away when I was 7, and she left me a house. So I had a house. She'd been a florist in Chelsea, and right behind her flower shop, which I think is now a fancy estate agent selling property in like London, Paris and Monaco, she had bought a house, and so I'd lived in that at the time, but I was not, I could rent that house out and make a salary essentially and live somewhere else. And then if the freelancing took a while to build up, as I expected it would, and I didn't expect the books to make any money, then I would still have basically a salary, an income from the house. So I was in an incredibly lucky position where that was an option open to me, and I knew that I'd have some financial security. That is not the case for most people. So the fact that I was even able to do that was a real indulgence. But anyway, so that's what I did. I rented out the house. I moved in with my boyfriend at the time, my now husband, and started working freelance. And like I said, I was very lucky. My first book, did pretty well, not, straight off the bat, but over time. And so, over time, it became clear that this was going to work financially, and I would be able to make money off writing books and working freelance. And, that was, very, very gratifying, but it was not what I'd expected. I'd expected to really struggle, and had provided for what I imagined would be a real financial struggle with, renting out the house.
We appreciate your candor on that. I think it's great that you're talking about that. openly. Just returning to the kind of succession with the books, obviously the Golden Thread in some ways was following on the concept and the idea of colour, but then The Race to the Future it's a different kind of thing. It's a narrative history book and so forth. What was it like, selling that idea to your publishers and seeing through a project that was different to a genre that you'd met great success in before?
So I think it's fair to say that publishers like authors to work within a kind of a field. Like if you've had a success in a particular type of book, it makes a lot of sense for your next book to be fairly similar to the first book. And that way, all the people who liked the first book and who you took on that journey with you on the first book will go and buy the second. And that was the case with The Secret Lives of Colour and The Golden Thread. A lot of people who are interested in colour are also interested in textiles. That it's not an obvious leap to cars and early 20th century automobile racing. And therefore, I'm sure my publishers won't mind me saying that they weren't expecting me to really want to write about the Peking to Paris 1907 race, and it probably wouldn't have been their first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, or 10th, 11th, 12th, 100th idea for book number 3. However, I won them over with my charm and enthusiasm and by stamping my foot and saying I wouldn't do anything else. It was kind of this or nothing. I knew I really wanted to write this book, and I think by dint of being a spoilt brat, throwing my toys out the pram and being very stubborn and cleaving to this idea, it became obvious that this is all I want to do. But, I do think that they've forgiven me and they are as delighted with the result as I am. But yes, I think it makes sense. If you've got someone who's working well in one genre, why would you risk it by throwing them into another, which they might suck at? I definitely didn't find it easy to go to a very different type of book and a very different type of structure. I wanted to challenge myself. I knew that I wanted to carve out a slightly bigger field for myself in book writing, and I wanted to challenge myself, and I wanted to try something different, and I wanted to, the first 2 books, I'd done a little bit of primary source research, but it had predominantly been secondary source, and I knew that this one I wanted to really go back to my history roots and really write, something that I found very, something challenging, something reliant on primary sources. And, that was important to me. And, if it's really important to you and you need this, then hopefully you can take your publishers with you, as I was able to do.
How have the publishers sort of positioned it and compared with the first 2 books? How have you found sort of experience of promoting it and publicising it?
I mean, I've only just begun. It literally got published yesterday, so officially, and the launch was on the Monday of this week. So, the experience of really publicising it, again, like I said, I'm not expecting it. I don't necessarily expect the book to just come out off the shelves and be a massive success on day one. I hope it'll have a long tail. I would like it to have a long tail, and I'd like it to be a slow burn. So that the publicity has only just begun. But it's tricky. The books, the talks that I've done for The Secret Lives of Colour and for The Golden Thread over the years, people have often asked me what I'm working on next, and I've mentioned this idea, and people sound enthusiastic, and I think that a lot of people who are interested in history are interested in lots of different parts of history, unless you're my dad and then all you want to read is the First World War, but I'm probably not going to get people like him anyway. Maybe I will, but we'll see. But, some people just do read one very narrow genre or area, but I think a lot of people are open to more than one. I know I, as a reader, don't just read one thing, and so I imagine that the readers that I'm writing for maybe are a bit like me and are interested in a few different subjects. And for me, that there is a bit of a link. I think I've tried to think, as I've been writing this book, about what it is that really attracts me to a subject, what it is that can sustain that level of focus over 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years of research. what are those topics that really grab me? And I think for me, it's topics that are everyday but are overlooked and have a kind of hidden importance that isn't obvious at first glance. And that's definitely true for colours, that's definitely true for textiles, and I also think that's definitely true for the car. And so there is a thread connecting all three, but it's not super obvious. They're not going to be situated in the same area of bookshops. But, to be fair, that's also true of The Secret Lives of Colour and The Golden Thread. They're, very often not in the same area of bookshops either. So, it's tricky. And, the publicity, I'm sure, I'll contact some people who are really enthusiastic about The Secret Lives of Colour or The Golden Thread, and then I'll be like, meh, I'm not that interested in The Race to the Future. But hopefully enough people will be, and hopefully I can also find a new audience. And like I said, I do think there is this continuum, and I'm hoping that is strong enough to take readers with me. And if the reception to my talks and the reception to the idea that I've mentioned in these talks about the race to the future has been any indication, then people will come with me, and I just have to keep my fingers crossed that that is the case.
We're coming up against our time limit, but kind of final question from me. You mentioned earlier the Radio 4 Book of the Week. You've also had a Sunday Times Book of the Year, shortlisted for a Somerset Maugham Award. What has been the role of that kind of formal recognition in the development of your career, do you think?
So the thing that has made most difference, I mean, I hate to say it, it's very disloyal to print media, which I love, and, where I got my start, and also what I love to read personally. But I found that extracts in newspapers and magazines have played, and also reviews in newspapers and magazines have played far less of a role than I imagined they would do. And what has really made the difference is radio and podcasts, which I think is a bit of a shame. But I think, when books were reviewed in places like, the Times or the TLS or something like that, I would be kind of expecting this wave of like, well done, congratulations, just saw a great review of your book in X, Y, or Z. And very often I won't get any of that. No one seems to notice. And I get a big bump when something is mentioned on radio or podcasts. That's it. It show, you can see it in the raw data, and I can see it in the kind of social media response. Like I said, I'm sure these things do have an impact. I know that booksellers, for example, still take great notice of what is being reviewed, and so it is really important. But this does seem to be a bit of a bigger impact from radio and podcasts. So the Radio 4 Book of the Week, which I'm incredibly lucky to have had for the first two books, and coming up for The Race to the Future as well. That's coming out as Radio 4 Book of the Week in mid-November 2023, has had a huge impact for all three books. And, I'm very lucky to have had it for all three of my books. That isn't the norm. As when it comes to formal recognition like prizes, one of my books was shortlisted for the Somerset Maugham Award, and that was a fantastic feeling. I went to the ceremony. The ceremony fell in the middle of a holiday, so I actually kind of left the holiday, went to the award ceremony, and then went back to the holiday, which was, it was really great to see the book celebrated in that way. And I would love to, I would be lying if I said I wouldn't love to win a history prize or an award. But actually, the things that really stick with me are the times when individual readers have got in touch, and I'm very lucky that they do quite often, to say that the book has really mattered to them. I've had like parents getting in touch to say that they read, chapters of The Secret Lives of Colour to their children, like one every night. I had this very sweet email from a man who had wooed his wife during coronavirus using chapters of The Secret Lives of Colour, and then they very sweetly got married, and they themed their wedding around The Secret Lives of Colour. They gave copies to all their guests, and the theme was colour, and they sent me photos. It was amazing. you know, that is so wonderful. That is so magical to affect the lives, you know, even it sounds very grand to affect the lives, but to kind of earn space on individual people's bookshelves and to find a way into strangers' lives in this really wonderful way. It sounds really cheesy, but I'm really being honest to say that matters so much more than reviews. I you know, reviews are super important. My publishers would be horrified that I'm saying any of this, I'm sure, but I can't even remember where The Secret Lives of Colour was reviewed now. It's a few years ago, but I do remember those emails from readers. So I think for me, that's what matters.
Well, that feels like a lovely and fitting note to end on. So thank you, Kassia, for talking to us, and wishing you the very best with this book and everything else you have going on going forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Kassia St. Clair. She's on Twitter at Kassia St. Clair. She's on Instagram at Kassia Writes. And The Race to the Future is published by John Murray. Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with Kassia?
I really enjoyed having Kassia on the show. As we alluded to briefly at the beginning, she was the founding co-host of Always Take Notes. So she and I did the show together for about a year and a half. So it was great to have her back on, and, you know, also to discuss all her huge successes that she's had since then. I thought it was very interesting to talk to her about how she'd had this very big success with The Secret Lives of Colour, and then followed it up in the same vein, and then I think pretty boldly and commendably had kind of pushed to strike out in a different direction with The Race to the Future, which was, I think, not the easy option, but one that I think, long term will have payoffs. Rachel, what do you think?
Agree. It was lovely to speak to someone who's been so important in the history of Always Take Notes. She's also been a key influence on my career, as we also alluded to. She's kindly steered me both at The Economist and when I joined this podcast. So I'm grateful to her for that. And it's wonderful to see her career going from strength to strength. I thought lots of aspects of the conversation were fascinating and useful, actually. The importance of working out your own methods, the challenges of juggling different projects, and also the experience of producing The Race to the Future as a departure from what she's done previously. What have you been up to, Simon? You're back on your other book project.
Yeah, I'm back in the mountains. Yeah, so I flew to Geneva on Friday, and then like we were saying off air, I had a slightly fraught couple of days, which was moving stuff around and driving to different places, but complicated by the fact that there was a lot of snow, and I'd hired a car which didn't have proper winter tyres, just a sort of unsatisfactory set of snow socks. So slightly fraught couple of days of driving from Seist to Briançon, and then Briançon to Grenoble, but both myself and the car survived without damage, so that was okay. And yeah, it's good to be back in the Alps, but it has been a lot of juggling and organisation and stuff with the project. So I'm quite tired. What about you, Rachel?
Well, everything is copy, as Nora Ephron, I believe, said. So, you know, make a note of it and make it funny when you write the book. What have I been up to? I went to see The House of Bernarda Alba recently at the National, which I enjoyed. Harriet Walter was on sort of typically forbidding form. And what else have I been watching? I quite enjoyed Louis Theroux's interview with Joan Collins recently. For anyone who's interested in Hollywood history, obviously she starred in Dynasty. It was quite fun, but she's also had a pretty grim time as well over the years. So I found that very insightful. And she's shifted 50 million books or something mad like that. So yes, that's what I've been watching and consuming. How about you, Simon?
I haven't been doing very much reading, actually, because I've been so busy. But I did last weekend. I read some really interesting magazine pieces. So I read Sophie Elmhurst, who is an alumna of Always Take Notes, in the Guardian long read, on a very moving piece, I thought, about love in an old people's home, which was interesting because the way it was written. So it kind of eschewed kind of conventional sort of declarative sentence quote journalism to be much more narrative and kind of novelistic in its approach. And I thought it was, in that situation, very effective. So I really like Sophie's writing and would recommend it to all our listeners. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.